remember a different scenario, but at least as long as I've been around, it hasn't been like that. The change in classification that's being proposed does not change the individual's reporting chain of command. Whether or not this veteran service officer is a program manager or a program coordinator, they will continue to report to the Director of Health and Social Services, and that's how that operation has been for a very long time. The concept of increasing the salary is frankly born out of some meetings that we had last year where I think a lot of the veterans were there and suggested that the salary was just currently too low and not commensurate with the qualifications of the veteran service officer that we should have, and the board, I believe, agreed with that notion that we needed to address that issue. That's what this agenda item contemplates, is raising that salary from a range 16 to a range 22. In consultation with the director of the department and our personnel folks, we believe the range 22 is commensurate with the supervisory requirements of the job. As Ms. Brawley stated earlier, there's one full-time employee and a couple of part-time employees that are supervised by this position. And we think that's where it falls in line with other positions in the county that have commensurate responsibility. So thus the recommendation for upgrading the position to a range 22. With regard to the potential moving, and I've received several phone calls over the past week or so regarding this, and I appreciate each and every one of them for your perspectives on those. The notion that, which I heard that the county was intending to kick the veterans out of the building is I can say absolutely unfounded in terms of county administration perspective. There was never any intent to kick any veterans organizations out of the veterans building. Ms. Brawley did go to the board in December and ask for the board's direction to explore the possibility of moving some of the veteran service office functions out of there. And the reasoning, frankly, is that it's very difficult to manage employees in a setting that's distant from the administration, in a building which has some technological challenges, and in a building whose main function is a social atmosphere. As you all know, we have two bars that are in the building, managed by a couple of the veteran service organizations who have their own liquor licenses and so on, which is a great thing. However, it does come with the creation of somewhat of a social environment, and the veteran service officer obviously has very important work to do. In the final analysis over the last couple of months, it's been the conclusion of, to date at least, of Ms. Brawley and myself, that there's no recommendation, as you can see if you read the packet, to move the veteran service officer out of that building. And that's, in large part due to the input that we've received from you all. But hopefully that provides a little bit of background about where we are and where we are going and what is and is not proposed to be changed. If the board did propose to change who the veteran service officer reports to and have it directly report to the board of supervisors, I would suggest that the board ask council to evaluate the county code that applies and that resulted in the current organization, because I think those would be required to be changed.
Thank you, Mr. Egan. Jim, go ahead.
Want me to go first?
You go first.
Okay. I'm going to stand up because I think it'll be easier for people to see me and hopefully to hear me. And I appreciate those who are in attendance on this particular issue. And unlike Mr. Egan, I've been around here a long time and remember how the organization operated and functioned. And the existence of a veteran service office position actually predates the creation and existence of the county administrative office. So that position goes back long before even your job existed. So when I first was involved with the county back in the 70s, the VSO reported directly to the board, It was a part-time position that was funded fully by the county general fund. It's not a required position under law. It's not a position that we have to have or a position that there's funding for. The only reason why the position existed in the first place is because the Board of Supervisors many, many years ago, probably sometime after World War II, to deal with the veterans and the needs of veterans at that time, and it could easily go back to, I could not find the historical record where it kind of basically began. It could theoretically go all the way back to the 1920s, as Bob Stone talked about the deed of the property and the building of the Veterans Hall. But for sure, after World War II, the position of the VSO became an important county-funded position. It was a priority that the Board of Supervisors then, long before I ever joined the board, and that's like before dirt. So, but anyway, the point being is that I think this board, as all boards before, has had a commitment for the Veteran Service Program. The building itself, when I joined the board in the 70s, was in pretty poor shape. It had been used primarily as a gym in those years, the 60s and 70s, as they were building the new high school. I remember as a freshman in high school attending class inside the Veterans Memorial Building across the street. And they had basketball hoops, and that's where we practiced and where we played some of our games, because the big gym was being utilized fully by the older students. It wasn't really until, and Joe Spears was the Veteran Service Officer that I first had a chance to deal with as a supervisor. And Joe, like many of the VSOs we've had since then, was one of those dynamic individuals. The county always relied on retired vets who were drawing a retirement from the military and filling that position. And because they could only earn so much money without compromising their retirement benefits, the salary of the VSO was always kept at a relatively low level by design. And that design wasn't something that the county necessarily imposed. It was something that was done to accommodate the individuals who wanted to work in that particular position. And it was kind of and it was a part-time position. It was not considered full-time. They only worked basically 4 days a week in terms of what was on the books. Now, we all know that the VSOs really worked 7 days a week. They were always available to take care of the needs whenever the veterans came forward and had a need to be worked on. And primarily, the VSO was designed to try to connect our veterans population, which is fairly large in Lassen County, always has been, with the big VA services primarily in Reno, but throughout the whole system. So that was the dynamics that I was used to when I came on board in the late 70s. By the 1990s, I think there was a kind of a shift in with the establishment of the county administrative office and the organization of the county departments. The Veteran Service Office started gravitating into what is now the Health and Social Service model. And I believe it was during John Kettleson's administration as the CEO that we saw the VSO actually affiliated with and under the supervision of Health and Social Services. It was kind of more of a management and budgetary tool, but I don't think it was designed to circumvent the true purpose of what the VSO position was established originally for. The other thing that became a matter of priority, and for the past 25 years as a board member, I've worked real hard working with the Veterans Task Force that was established at my request back in 1989 to try to revitalize that building, to make that building viable as a facility to serve and meet the needs of the veterans population. And I think that's something that we've seen a lot of progress being made. You drive up and down Main Street now, and probably the coolest building we have in town to look at is our Veterans Memorial Building, especially with the paint job that was accomplished by the task force or under the direction of the task force working with the Department of Public Works. And let's speak a little bit. Mr. Egan is correct about the fact that the building is under the physical responsibility of the Department of Public Works to assure that it maintains its integrity. But the use of that building is actually governed by this Veterans Memorial Hall Task Force that was established. It's 9 members that are constituted. 5 of the 9 members are representatives of the 5 various veterans groups that use the building. There's a 6th member who is the VSO. that is located there, not for the purposes of running the building, but to where their services are provided. And 6 of those 9 positions are directly related to and associated with the veterans in the building. The other 3 positions, one of them is a county/city position that I hold as a representative with the Board of Supervisors to provide the connectivity back to the governing board of the county and the funding. The Director of Public Works is another seat, and that is generally filled by the Deputy Director of Public Works, Pete Heimbigner, who currently holds the job, who really is the hands-on person to make sure that whatever needs to take place to maintain that building is taking place. And then the 9th seat is a public member at large that could be a veteran, could be anybody. So the functional control of that building and how that building is utilized is under the purview of that Veterans Memorial Task Force. And they make recommendations directly back to the Board of Supervisors. And in the 25 years that it's been in existence, I cannot recall one time where the Board of Supervisors did not accept the recommendations of how that building is to be used. So if there are concerns and complaints, and I've heard some in recent weeks and months about how the building is being used, the people who control the use of that building are our veterans organizations through the Veterans Task Force. So those are the folks. They meet every other month on the first Wednesday of the month at 1:30 at the Vets Hall. It's open to the public. They're public meetings. Each one of those members that serve have to fill out a 700 form, which identifies their conflicts of interest. It's a position that was created by ordinance and by resolution of the board. And so it's an official position, and if anybody's interested in serving, it's a good place to serve. We have a lot of work to be done on that building, and that task force is going to continue that. Now, I've heard some criticisms about the fact that the veterans are going to be kicked out in favor of restrooms. Well, first of all, the ADA requirements that are in place that, to be honest with you, are not designed necessarily to serve the needs of the general public, but to serve the needs of our veterans is what needs to be addressed. And right now there's a project in place that's going forward, hopefully this spring, that's going to develop a whole new entrance opportunity to both the upstairs and the downstairs that is going to meet the ADA requirements. And once that project is completed, the task force is going to be evaluating where we can install on the main floors some handicapped equipped restrooms. And the current facilities that we have, even though some have suggested meet that, are totally inadequate. First of all, there's no signage for the so-called handicapped restroom on the main floor on the west side of the stage area. And besides, anybody who's sitting in an audience like this at a performance and the handicapped restroom is right there and the person who needs to use it has to parade in front of the users of the building, I can tell you right now, is not acceptable. But we're going to be seeing some changes made there. But the important thing to remember, at least from the task force perspective and my perspective, is the use of that building and the offices up front are going to be maintained for veterans services. So even if they have to be jockeyed around to accommodate developing some adequate restroom facilities that meet the needs of all the people, including and especially our veterans, is going to be something that we worked out, and it will be decided by that task force in terms of what recommendations will be coming forth. So it's not something that's going to be shoved down anybody's throat. It's going to be basically of the veterans, by the veterans, and for the veterans in that capacity. Now, I'd just like to finish up, if I could, Mr. Chairman, and talk about the VSO and the structure. And I appreciate the comments that were made by several of the speakers. I think that the Veterans Service Office should not be one that is necessarily dependent. I've actually discussed with Mr. Egan and have recommended to him that it's obvious that we need to up the funding for that position, that relying upon part-time retired military vets to fill that position, that we need to have that filled by a professional, full-time, fully funded position, not from some WA fund or some social service fund or whatever fund it is, but from the county general fund. And we're only talking about $10,000 being added roughly to the budget. Could even be more, probably should be more than that. But with the $100 million budget that we have in the county to operate with, I think there's more than enough room in there to be able to fully fund a VSO position full-time for a degreed, qualified individual who is a veteran, who understands veterans and works for veterans at the Veterans Hall. And that's going to be my recommendation. And I think in order to reinstate, I think, the connectivity that was there, I think that that position, just like we have at the fair manager and a few other positions that the Board of Supervisors are responsible to hire and make the appointment, even though they will be supervised by the county administrative office. That is how we restructure the program and not make it being a subpart of Health and Human Services or any other department, but actually make it a position that reports directly to the Board of Supervisors, that's fully funded by the Board of Supervisors out of the general fund, and not rely upon either the state or federal government to subsidize that program, so that we have a position that works to our satisfaction for the benefit of all the veterans in the county, in the building that we're working day after day to try to improve and make more functional. That, to me, I think is the direction that we should go as a board, and that will be the position I'll be voting for and advocating.
I really have nothing else to add, but I'd like to thank Richard for his clarification and for your historic review. I think it's very important. There is a need out there. You guys have expressed that, and we are here listening, and we're here to help. I mean, it's unfortunate some of the things got misconstrued, but I think it might have been a blessing in disguise. Thank you, everybody.
Jeff?
I just want to say I concur with Mr. Chapman. I think that it needs to be a county position, like it, and be structured like the fair manager is, where they answer to the board and not under Health and Human Services. Mr. Chapman has suggested.
Thank you, Jeff. Jim, thank you. That was very good. It helped me a lot. You got the, obviously, the history. I had one question. Barbara Keeling, when she addressed us, she spoke of some funds that were not legally being used, state funds or federal funds.
Yes, sir.
Could you bring that up again, and could staff, someone, respond to that? I'm very clear on that.
It's my understanding that the veteran services are funded by the federal government, all the veterans programs. So I don't understand how federal funds could be used for county issues or state issues.
Who would that, Mr. Collins?
I don't have the exact figure, but veteran services, the services and benefits that veterans receive are absolutely funded with federal money. The Veteran Service Office functions, though, are funded through CalVet, which gets some federal funding to do that, but the majority of the money is state funding. The CalVet funds that we receive in this county are about $1,000 to $3,000 a year. And we get a few dollars for offsetting, so for every time a vet is approved for VA medical and they're not receiving medical anymore, there's some work credits we get in funding that comes along with that. The rest of the money comes from the general fund, and then there's $20,000 from a Mental Health Services Act grant that our department applied for on behalf of the vets, and then there's $20,000 from our own behavioral health department in Mental Health Services Act funding to supplement that grant that pays for the Veteran Peer Specialist program. That's how that funding comes to the Veteran Service Office.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. Does that answer your question? It's much more clear to me.
A little bit.
Okay. Thank you. All right. With that, any more questions? Mrs. Smith.
I just need a little clarification. Sometimes when you want to give somebody a raise, you change their title, and that then changes their pay scale. Is that why you're doing this? Because it says from a separate department to a division within the health. Is this how you're getting them a raise? I mean, is that even necessary? And if it's not, if you don't have to do that process to give the man a raise, then why can't you leave everything alone? Because that seems to be the greatest concern here, is that this move to health department or
I'll be
division.
very frank. The problem I've had in the last while is that there is confusion about who's in charge of the Veterans Service Office. Now, the Veteran Service officers belong to the veterans organizations. I totally support that. They need to be active participants in that because I think they're wonderful organizations. But the Veteran Service Office has a very particular job to do. They receive state money to do that. And it gets to be a problem when they're doing activities that are not being funded by the county and the state under that veteran service office duties. And so I'm not there, there's no one else around on site to give them direction. When they need direction, they get to take a direction from the organizations and other veterans. And then it's really muddy about who's in charge. I've been in charge of the Veteran Service Office for a while. And this would clarify that organization chart a little bit. But if it becomes a county position, then it's for me.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Kelly Gary.
I just want to say that if we mistreat our veterans, God will never smile upon us, ever. So remember that.
Let me just say, there's no intent of anybody else up here in this room to mistreat the veterans. We all highly respect them. We definitely want to do what's best for them. Jim, I'm going to leave it to you if you can have the most.
Okay, I'll be happy to make a motion. And first of all, I missed the presentation in December that Ms. Brawley made to the board. And it wasn't until a few weeks later after the article was made in the newspaper, Moose caught me at a pool board meeting and quizzed me about the status. And I was actually had left the board meeting to go attend the pool board meeting. Couldn't be in two places at once. And I'm sorry that I wasn't there, because I think had I been attuned to that, I would have expressed to Ms. Brawley then and even the county administration much how I feel today. I would like to make a motion, Mr. Chairman, that the county administrative officer be directed to bring back to the board a plan which would restore the Veteran Service Office as a separate operation under the direction of the Board of Supervisors and the CAO, away from the Health and Human Services organization, and that we proceed with the advertising and filling of the position as a full-time county position funded from county general funds. Now, as that would be the motion, but as a side to that, as a clarification, so it can be put in perspective, Ms. Brawley relayed what the budget is. It's roughly about $100,000 is the budget for the VSO, and has always been underwritten by the county general fund. The fact that the state would give us some funding from time to time, and it wasn't consistent, or how it would vary, or whether a federal grant would become available to fund some peer specialists to augment that budget, those were always considered extras. The actual core funding of the operation of the VSO has always been the county general fund, and that would be part of what this motion would be, direct how we would augment additional general fund resources to bring that position up to an acceptable level for hiring.
Thank you, Jim. Do you have a second to that motion?
I'll second it.
We got a second by Mr. Hemphill. Any more discussion of the board? Mr. Regan?
Sure. I guess I would just like some clarification on the motion. Currently, we're, as Ms. Brawley stated, we're funding the position through several sources, and those sources are in some cases only eligible to be used for the Veteran Service Officers. I certainly wouldn't want to turn that money away from state or federal agencies.
The motion doesn't expect that. We would utilize those funds to augment the general fund funding. But if those funds were to go away, and they can just as easily, I think the intent of the motion is to make sure that 100% of the funding, if necessary, would come from the general fund. If there are available federal and state funds that can offset the general fund to a degree, that's fine. But the perspective I think is important to get across is that this is not going to be a federally funded or a state-funded position. This is going to be a county general funded position. The fact that we utilize those funds from time to time does not shift the burden of the responsibility of that position away from the general fund to those federal funds. And when they go away, oops, well, I guess we have to cut back the job. I know how the bureaucracy works, and I'm not going to support that.
Okay. Before we vote, any questions? Does everybody understand it? Turn back to real. We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I have a sore throat. I'm trying not to.
State your name.
Karen Ann Hayes. I'm not a veteran, and this is to me a new person. I do have veterans on both sides of my family, including World War I, my grandfather, to be a clause that a veteran or a previous veteran, whether it be 2 years, 4 years, whatever, hold that position as a full-time position?
My understanding of federal law, that if you have a veteran service position, even one that you create yourself, that it has to be held or occupied by a veteran. So a non-veteran cannot serve as a veteran service officer, my understanding of federal law. But I could be correct.
It's actually contained in the minimum qualifications of the job description.
Our job description requires, but I think whether it did or didn't include that, I think federal law requires if you're going to have a veteran service officer who interacts with the Veterans Administration, it has to be a veteran.
Thank you for your, Diana.
I just would like some clarification. You're requesting that the veteran service budget unit be moved totally out from health and social services. That's separate.
That would make me very happy.
I guess the question is that the direction of the board? Is that part of the motion?
I think that's the intent of the motion.
Can we restate that, please, for Madam Clerk?
To move the ESL budget unit out from health and services fund 110 to their own fund.
What are we going to do now? Okay. Before we vote, anybody else have a question for clarification?
And is the second assent to that modification motion?
Second, yes. Okay. Seeing no more questions, is it clerk to call the order?
Supervisor Chapman?
Aye.
Supervisor Alba?
We can have some more, well, okay.
Aye. He's got it really fast.
Supervisor Hamel?
Aye.
Supervisor Pyle?
Aye. Okay. That concludes.
Mr. Chairman, just
Yes, sir.
a point that this will necessitate further action of the board, so we won't be recruiting for a veteran service officer until that further action is taken, because we don't have a proper job description.
The motion was to have the CAO bring this back in a form that we can finalize, and I'm confident he will.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute recess, and then we'll do state executive.